All right, in this video, we're going to go over the third section of our chapter, which covers the lab safety and art equipment. Starting with safety, it's important to take care of it right now because in the later chapters we'll be starting looking at chemical reactions. And so for that, actually need to use real chemicals, not just household supplies like we've been using so far. Yes, the safety rules and guidelines, they're meant to protect you, right? Because in this class, we're going to get to do a lot of really neat labs and see a lot of neat things, but it's not worth it if you're getting hurt. So I just want to make sure that we go over these rules, that we all understand them on how to be safe, and so we can have a good time with all of our labs. All right, so we could go into a lot of detail for these safety rules and just have something specific for every type of scenario, but I've broken it down into just four simple guidelines. So I just talk about these so we understand what they are. So the first rule that we have for a lab is to always wear the appropriate clothes and your safety equipment. So now what that means is that when you're working in a lab, make sure that you're not wearing any loose clothing or baggy, bulky clothing. So if you like to wear a jacket inside, I just ask that you take it off while you're working on the lab just to cut back on any unnecessary bulk. If you have long hair, make sure that it's tied back neatly, and this is just to keep your hair from possibly catching on fire. All right. When working in a lab, make sure that you avoid wearing sandals. Make sure you wear something closed-toed because if you spill something on the floor and it gets on your feet, it's a lot better if it gets on your shoes first than if it gets on the skin of your feet. Let's see. And when working with chemicals or something that might spill over, splash, it's important to wear safety goggles to protect your eyes. And also, whenever we're working with maybe we're working with gases and so whatever we have them in might explode, definitely you want to protect your eyes from being damaged. All right. Secondly, make sure that you read all the directions before you start the lab. You should know exactly what you're doing and have a game plan before you even get to a lab station. Make sure if you have any questions on any of the steps or if there's something you don't understand, make sure that you ask before you start the lab, not in the middle of it. All right, when you're finished working with your chemicals, make sure that you clean up properly. So that means that if there's any wastes that you have, make sure that it doesn't just get flushed down the sink or in a trash can. Make sure that you put it in the proper waste container. If you have any leftover chemicals, make sure that you see me about them because you don't want to be contaminating the clean chemicals that we have. All right, and the last point on this, and really the most important one that I shouldn't even have to say, is to just act responsibly whenever you're working in a lab. Because if you're in a lab, if you have all this equipment around you and you're working with these chemicals and you're playing around with the equipment, if you're making jokes and if you're not paying attention or just screwing around, it's that you are a danger to yourself and to the people around you and I can't allow that. So if you show me that I can't trust you, then you won't get to participate in all these really neat labs we'll be doing. And instead, I'll have some boring alternative assignment for you to do just because I can't trust you. So please just don't let it come to that. Just make sure you know what you're doing in a lab and that you're not doing anything that could be dangerous to someone else. Next up, we have the safety symbols, just some things to keep in mind for when we're working through our labs. So this first one is a symbol of overall. So this just means protective clothing. You want to cover up as much skin as you can to prevent it from ever getting anything spilled on it. All right. So for us, we'll be having aprons to protect your body, and we won't be working with any chemicals that are too harsh that you would hurt yourself with. All right, next up, we have some safety symbols, and we need to understand what they mean and know how to protect ourselves in a lab setting. So this first one is just a symbol of overalls or a jumpsuit, and this just means protective clothing because the easiest way to protect yourself from any harsh chemicals is to just cover up as much skin as you can with some heavy duty clothing. All right. Next, we have the eye protection. Because guys, you have two eyes, and it's really hard and expensive to try and replace those. So it's better to be safe than sorry, especially when it comes to your eyesight. So just make sure that you're always wearing your safety goggles, so you don't regret not wearing them later on. And finally, we have gloves. In this class, we'll be working with nitrile gloves to protect the skin on your hands from getting anything spilled on them, so you don't get a chemical burn with anything. So it's just in the name of safety, we want to protect as much skin on your body as we can. All right, these next symbols are all about the different chemicals that we can use. So make sure that you read all these warnings before you start working with the chemicals. So the first one has a flame on it, and this just means that the chemical is flammable. So you want to be careful if you're working around a flame. Make sure that the chemical doesn't start burning, or when you're heating it up, make sure it doesn't get so hot that it catches fire. All right, this next one, skull and crossbones. You've seen it before. It means pirates. It means death. In our case, it means that it's toxic. And so when you're working in a lab, first of all, you shouldn't put anything in your mouth. But when you're working with something that is toxic, you want to be extra careful and make sure that you don't taste it or inhale it or ingest it in any way. All right, next up, we have here corrosive chemicals. So when this is the case, you want to be very careful that you don't spill anything on yourself or on anything, any surface, any tables, on the floor, in the sink, because it could very potentially destroy our equipment and really, really hurt yourself really badly. So just make sure you're very careful when working with corrosive chemicals like acids and bases. This next one tells us that there's a danger of an explosion. So make sure that you're very careful when working with these chemicals. You know, they're even more dangerous than the flammable ones. So make sure that they don't catch fire in any way, um, and make sure that you're very careful with the containers that they are in as well. This black X just means that whatever chemical we're working with is an irritant. So it's not as bad as all the other ones that we've seen so far, like the corrosive and the toxic chemicals, but it's still not pleasant to spill it on yourself. So just make sure that you avoid getting this on your skin or in your eyes or ingesting it in any way. And then finally, we have the symbol, which just means that the chemicals could be an environmental hazard. So you want to be very careful when you're disposing of it, when you're throwing it away. Make sure that it does not wash, that it doesn't get washed down the sink, that it doesn't go in the trash can. Make sure that it goes in the proper waste containers. And when you're working with any sort of chemical, you should just assume that all of these warning labels apply to them, and this is just so you can be as safe as you can when working with the chemicals. All right, next we have the safety symbols that apply to our equipment. So let's look at what some of these are. So first we have this lightning bolt on a yellow background. So this means that we're working with electrical currents. So make sure that you're very careful about the things that you're grabbing. Make sure that you don't grab anything that is conductive to electricity so you don't shock yourself and electrocute yourself. This next one is the radiation symbols, which means that we might be working with some type of equipment that puts out radiation, and if you don't protect yourself, if you don't wear the right clothes, then you could potentially damage your DNA, and you definitely don't want to get into that over just working in a lab. So be very careful when working with radioactive equipment. This next one means that we are working in a magnetic field, so make sure that you're careful when working in a magnetic field with any jewelry or watches that you might be wearing, or if you have any dental work or implants, make sure you're careful when working around the magnetic equipment. Right, this next one means that we are working with a laser, and so you should never point a laser at any person, definitely not at their face, and then just don't point a laser at anything you're not supposed to be working with, right? So when working with lasers, make sure that you're wearing the proper eye protection to protect yourself, your eyes as best as you can. And this last one, notice that there's a little steam lines coming off a plate at the bottom. It just means that there's a hot surface at work. So be very careful about the things that you're touching. You definitely don't want to burn your hands or your skin just because you weren't paying attention that something was hot. Next is just some basic safety equipment. You've seen it before. So first is the fire extinguisher. Make sure that you know where it's located in every room that you're in if you ever need to use it in an emergency. And the second is our safety shower and the eye wash station. It's located over in our chemistry lab next door. And if you ever have any large spill on yourself of some chemical, you want to get underneath that shower as quickly as you can. You pull the lever and then it'll douse you with water. So you want to make sure that you rinse off anything that was spilled on yourself. And then if you get anything on your face and in your eyes, you definitely want to use the eye wash station, which is a sink and it's got two spouts of water facing up. So you want to lean forward, you activate the lever, and you put your face in the running water. And you might have to hold your eyes open to make sure that you can rinse out anything that got in your eyes. All right, next up we have our lab equipment. This comes down to the glassware and the tools that we might be using. So let's start with the glass. We have three different types, or three main types that we'll be using. And so first we have the test tubes here on the left. And so these test tubes, notice that they're very long and thin, and they don't hold a lot of liquid. We just use them for when we only need a small amount of chemicals. And so they don't usually hold very much liquid, so it's usually between 5 milliliters and 25 milliliters, just very small amounts, and it's very good for just simple reactions. All right, next we have the beaker. This is good for mixing and making different solutions. So the beaker is a cylinder all the way through, and then at the very top it has a very wide mouth and a spout on the side, which makes it good for pouring into different containers. And so we'll be using the beakers for when we're using chemicals that aren't harsh. Usually we'll be making solutions with water and then some other chemical in it. All right, and the last one is this one in the middle. This is called the Erlenmeyer flask. And notice that it has a very distinct shape from the other ones. It has a wide bottom and a narrow neck. And so having this shape, it makes it a lot more safe for spills. It spills a lot less. For this reason, we use it for chemicals that are a little bit stronger. So when we're working with strong acids and strong bases, the things that we don't want to spill, they should always go in an Erlenmeyer flask because that's the safest container that we have. Also, sometimes we might have to be collecting a gas, so it's a lot easier to collect gas out of a narrow neck container like this one than it would be with a beaker. And finally, we have the equipment that we'll be using. So here we have our scale. We use this to measure mass, and notice that it has a digital display and a metal plate on top. It's a very sensitive instrument, so please make sure that you're not pressing down on the plate because that will mess up the calibration. And notice that we have also a balance, and that these two are very similar to each other. Right? They do the same thing. They measure mass, but notice that they do it a little bit differently. Where the scale will be digital, and you can calibrate differently. Whereas the balance, as the name says, is that you place something on the plate, and then whatever mass it has, you have to counteract it. You have to cancel it out on the other side with another weight. So that's the biggest difference between these two, is that the balance has to cancel out the weight on both sides, whereas the scale, you can just place anything and it'll tell you how much it weighs. And the last one on here is the hot plate. This we'll be using to heat up liquids in our beakers. And so notice that it's very similar to the scale, so make sure you're able to tell these two apart. And that's very important because one of these will burn you and the other one won't. But for the hot plate, notice that it has dials on the front to control the temperature, and the plate on top is usually made of ceramic, whereas with the scale, it'll be a metal plate. All right, and the last piece of equipment to go over is this graduated cylinder. So notice that it looks similar to a test tube kind of, but it has a base and it has all these little markings that we can use for measuring very accurately how much volume we're using of a certain liquid. So it's much better than at measuring volume than beakers and Erlenmeyer flasks, because even though they do have those markings for the volume, it's only about every 50 or every 100 milliliters. But the graduated cylinder, is good for fractions of a milliliter. It's a lot more accurate to use. So definitely you want to make sure that you measure your volumes using graduated cylinders and not beakers or flasks. Now, the proper way to read a graduated cylinder is that you want to set it down on a table and let it settle down so that it's not the liquid inside is not moving at all, and you want to get eye level with the to the level of the liquid. Now you'll see that the liquid will stick to the sides, so it will rise up on the sides, and it'll have a slight curve. So to get your volume reading, you want to make sure that you read the bottom of that curve, not the top of the curve. And so that'll make a very small difference, but it's still important to take that into account.